Our scripture text this morning comes from the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 1 to 13. And we're going to dive into Job. This is our first sermon, and then next week we'll have a second sermon on the book of Job. So it's a two-part sermon here. Instead of trying to put it all in at once, we're going to divide it up into two. There once was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now one day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" And Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro upon the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Skin for skin, all that people have they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, he is in your power, only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And Job took a potsherd with which to scrape himself, and he sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. And they met together to go and console and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads, and they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very, very great. Sermon title this morning is The Heretical Imperative. It's intended to be a provocative title intentionally, but we'll get to that towards the end of our sermon. One of my favorite cartoons growing up was Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck. Is it rabbit season? No, it's duck season. Rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season, duck season. Any other Looney Tune fans here this morning? So is it rabbit season or duck season? What do you see here? Do you see a rabbit or do you see a duck? Do you see a young woman or do you see an older woman? Are these lines parallel to each other? Seeing can be a complex business, can't it? There's an old proverb that says 90% of what a person sees lies behind the eyes. And this is literally true at a physical level. I suppose if Stan Hatch was here with us this morning, he could talk about that and tell us all about that. But if you do this for a moment, take a look at this grid and see that small black dot. Just go ahead and stare at that. Just stare at the small black dot on that screen for the next 15 seconds. And as you do that, I'll tell you that you are looking at what's called the Hermann-Herring illusion. Keep focusing on that black dot there. Don't take your eyes off of it until I invite you to stare at that little white dot now. And I'm wondering if, as you stare at that white dot, if anyone's seeing gray boxes appear How did that happen? Well, by focusing on the black dot and then staring at the white dot, the result was that we see a fainter gray color moving grid, and this fainter moving grid is the result of an after image which has been burned into the eyes at one location of that little black dot. And as we move our eyes, we begin to see movements that we may not have previously noticed. And so the brain structures visual stimuli into meaningful patterns. The brain believes these lines are not parallel, but they actually are. You could see a young woman or an older woman, or maybe you're able to see both. And you can see a duck or a rabbit, or maybe one or the other, but not both. And so our brain structure images into patterns which allow us to focus on some things and then screen out others. And so if that's true, if 90% of what we physically see lies behind our eyes, could it also be true that 90% of our vision of who God is lies behind the eyes, behind what we see? Could it be that who we say God is depends upon the patterns for how we see the world and how we see God that are lying in the recesses of our minds, that are lying back there? What a person is able to see in any given situation depends a great deal on the organizing and interpretive frameworks that person brings to it. And based upon those frameworks, some aspects of an experience will be made to appear significant, while others will be relegated to the edges or not perceived at all. And this is what happens in the book of Job. This is what happens in the conversation with Job and his three friends. We were introduced to Job and the man from the man of Uz. I always think of Oz. But in the land of Uz, and his name was Job. Blessed with 7 sons and 3 daughters, thousands of sheep and camel, hundreds of oxen and donkeys, and many servants. We're told that he was the greatest of all the people of the East. But as we heard earlier in the book, in the video that we showed to the children, Job loses all of his possessions. His oxen and donkeys, his means of production, are carried off by the Sabians. They're gone. His sheep, his economic asset, struck by lightning and burned up and gone. Camels, his mode of transporting his goods to market, they were raided and carried off by the Chaldeans. They're gone. His servants were killed by the edge of the sword. And finally, his sons and daughters are crushed as a windstorm destroys the eldest son's home. All gone. And in response, Job falls down to the ground and he says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away." And we're told that in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. And then, as we heard, Job is afflicted further with the painful sores. And in the face of these troubles, Job needs to be strengthened. He needs to be encouraged. He needs to be supported and sustained. And we're told that his 3 friends come and sit with him. For 7 days and 7 nights, they sit with Job. No one speaks a word, because his suffering was very great. The greatest man among all the peoples of the East has now become great in one more way in his suffering. But because of his friends' presence with him, their presence was enough to strengthen Job during his terrible troubles. And so after 7 days and nights of silence, Job finally decides to talk honestly about his situation. And he says, "Let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said a child is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine upon it." And that begins his angry lament to God. He talks honestly about his feelings. He gives voice to his suffering. And he ends his lament by saying, "Truly the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes." Now, ideally, Job speaking his honest lament, ideally it should break down the isolation that is so much a part of the devastation of acute suffering. But that isolation will only be broken if Job's speech can be received by a community of friends. And so his friends are faced with a choice. And any of us who have walked with someone who has gone through suffering, we also have faced that same choice. It's a choice that comes to us often wrapped with fear and temptation. Carol Newsom gives this description of it. She says, "The cry of despair can be so terrible that it opens us into a seeming abyss that one desires to make it stop, to muffle it, to silence it. And at such moments, it's very easy to confuse the needs of the sufferer with the impulses of one's own anxiety." Can we handle the anxiety we feel when someone faces a tragedy, a death? Can we handle the anxiety that comes when fundamental beliefs about the goodness of God, about the power of God, about the love of God are questioned by experience? Could Job's friends handle their anxiety and receive Job's speech? Well, as was said in the video, the major part of the book of Job is a dialogue among his friends and him. And when we read those dialogues, we discover that Job's friends could not handle it. They seek to stop Job's cry of despair. They seek to silence him. Eliphaz the Temanite, in chapter 4, verses 7 to 8 says, "Think now who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen it, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." A chapter later, in chapter 5, he says, "How happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he binds up. He strikes, but his hands heal. He will deliver you from 6 troubles, and 7 no harm shall touch you." Eliphaz seeks to justify Job's suffering with what I call a trite theological formula. That his suffering is a result of divine discipline. That is still very common. You might hear that theological formula when people experience difficulties or challenges. Oh, God is reproving. Even C.S. Lewis alluded to that in one of his books. This idea that suffering is divine discipline. Now, after Eliphaz, Bildad the Shuhite talks to Job. And he says to him basically, "Job, well, if your children sinned against him, well, he delivered them into the power of their transgressions." So he says, what happened to your children is the result of their sin. Your suffering is because of your children's sin. He says that if Job would seek God and make supplication, it will go well. Well, it doesn't get any better with Job's third friend. His third friend, Zophar, bluntly accuses Job. He says, "Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin." He basically says, "Well, Job, you're going through this because you've sinned. You need to repent." Job needed to be strengthened. Job needed to be supported. Job needed to be sustained in his troubles. And he even cries out, "In trouble like this, I need loyal friends." He certainly didn't need his 3 friends that were with him. They failed to be able to strengthen, to support, and sustain Job in his trial. Instead of being vessels of God's grace, they were obstacles to Job's healing. They would have been better off keeping their mouth shut. It's a lesson for us as well at times that the best thing we can do is just sit with people. Let them know that we are there, that we are present with them when they experience suffering. The question is Job's friends were not able to sit with their anxiety as they looked into his honest lament, into his lament and anger that he expressed. They wanted to quiet him. And the question for us is, can we be a faith community that is supple and resilient, that allows for and even encourages honest expression of anger and connection with suffering? See, if our beliefs are fragile or brittle, when someone honestly laments, the reaction often is to be defensive or repressive, right? To defend God's honor, to defend that God is just, or to state something that allows us to feel more comfortable in our own anxiety, instead of allowing that person to express themselves, instead of being open-minded and generous to them, instead of creating a space for that lament to be heard, we can be defensive. And so we're faced with another choice in that moment. We're faced with the choice of whether we'll choose to engage the practice that I call the heretical imperative. The heretical imperative. Now, it's an intentionally provocative name to get your attention, but I use it because the Greek word for heresy, the Greek word literally means to choose. To choose. So to practice the heretical imperative is to make choices. It's taking moments from time to time to reflect upon our world views, our assumed founding grids, and to lift them up and to examine them to see if they correspond to the biblical witness. Then after having done that work, having done that spiritual work, to choose a belief and to act upon it. Now it's an imperative because unlike years ago, where there was an authoritative tradition. And for many people, as long as that tradition was in the background, many people didn't have to pick or choose what they believed. They could simply surrender to the taken for granted consensus. But not in today's world. There's a plurality of religious options, and there's no authoritative tradition. And so, as a result, we have to choose. We have to practice this. See, in the face of seeming randomness of the terrible events in Job's life, his friends employed some founding interpretive frameworks, which allowed the suffering to be seen as divine discipline or punishment for sins. They were not able, or they were unwilling to set aside those worldviews and to listen to Job's honest and painful lament. And so instead of community forming, there was separation between Job and his friends. Now, Job rejects his paradigms throughout the book. He proclaims that he is innocent. But as we'll see next week, Job has his own paradigm of the world and of God. And the question next week we'll see is, can God provide Job with a different perspective that will allow Job's view of the world to be transformed? Like Job and his friends, we also have founding frameworks. And so the question I pose is, do we cling to pious platitudes, or are we willing to investigate and examine our frame of reference about the world, about God, and about suffering? Are we willing to test them so they work not only in times of prosperity, but also in times of trouble? Next week, we'll continue in our study of Job, looking at God's speech to Job from the storm, which offers us an alternative biblical view of God's power and God's creation. Until then, let us constantly be in prayer that God will open our eyes, that we may see glimpses of truth that God has, thou for us. Our response song this morning is open my eyes that I may see. Number 381. I invite us to sing it in the first person plural instead of in the personal first person singular. We're going to sing it in the first person plural, that we would open our eyes together, that God would open our eyes that we may see.